イタリウイスキーイタリビーよくでねばらなくましてくれて。おーノーそれにあのレビーLet's begin. Indeed.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. My name is Brian, and this is the Fireside Chat. And today I am joined by James L. Nuzzo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. PhD on, you're basically an academic researcher. You have a great blog on Substack. I've been kind of binge listening to your, your readings and looking at your articles. So welcome to the show, James.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Should I call you Dr. James Nuzzo or
it does not matter, man. Whatever you want.
Okay. I'm just not sure what the, I'm a little informal in my approach. So, but
informal's good. Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, good. So yeah, you have a really interesting Substack, which I linked to people in the description so they can go check it out, where you have like a bit of a mixture between a blog or like some written essays and podcasts and several interviews and discussions. And you have you've also written a lot of papers as well. So first of all, it's a bit of an interesting, like, say, mix of topics. You talk about men, but you also specifically talk about men's health and sort of like this, like the physical health conversation, as well as romantic realism in movies. So can you tell us a little bit about like what your blog or what your Substack is about?
Yeah, so mainly, my background is in exercise physiology or exercise science. So I do cover stuff within that space. But what's happened over the years is I've become more and more interested in men's health and sex and gender issues, in part because a lot of that socio-political discussion came into the health and medical sciences. And so I started to push back against some of that stuff. So my blog is an opportunity to publish things that would be difficult for me to get into academic journals because they don't fit the academic narrative. So I end up covering exercise science, but I also cover a lot of kind of gender bias issues against men. So the sort of thing you wouldn't hear in an academic journal. The movie stuff, I haven't quite got onto that yet. I've posted a little bit about that, but I will tie that in more and more as time goes on. So a lot of the graphs that I create, it's a very evidence-based blog. And so you'll see I've got lots of graphs ranging from health outcomes in men and women to, I focus a lot on funding. So funding differences for men's and women's health. And then, what's the budget for the Office of Research on Women's Health in the United States, things like that. So stuff that people have never put out there for discussion, I try to put that out there.
Yeah. So so were you doing exercise science, and like how does that tie into your interest in men's issues? Was there like a connection? Like I'm wondering how you got on this particular thread.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of a story, but there's a very specific pathway. So what happened was, after I finished my PhD in physiology or exercise physiology, a consensus statement was published in a major exercise science journal about creating equity in physical activity. And we now are all very familiar with the big DEI movement, but this was at the start of it around 2016, 17, before it really, really accelerated in academia. And that came into the exercise science space. And so basically the idea there was, moving forward, physical activity initiatives should focus on girls and women. It was part of what it was saying when it came to that, sex comparison. And I just said, hang on a minute. And there were many arguments I made against why that was very problematic and inappropriate. And then I realized that there was not a lot of good like men's health epidemiology stuff out there in the literature. So I started to write on men's health, just broadly speaking. And then we had another case in an exercise science journal where the authors were claiming that exercise students should be taught about gender-based violence in their coursework. Now, this was a completely one-sided presentation, which just was all about women being the victims and men being the perpetrators. And I had been paying enough attention to this literature to know that this is completely rubbish. So I teamed up with John Barry from the Center of Male Psychology in the UK and Deborah Pawnee, and we wrote a response letter saying this is completely inappropriate. This is not what the data show when it comes to intimate partner violence and stuff. So yeah, what's happened is it started to come into my field, and then I was pushing back, and then I just realized no one was talking about men's health in a serious way, I guess.
Yeah,
really
how could you say that? There's a whole, like, isn't there like a magazine literally called Men's Health? And isn't it like the total, like, I mean, they have a magazine. How is that not for men? Like, what are you talking about?
That's right. It's
so wait, but I will say this though. You said that there isn't a lot of real serious research done for men's health, like from this sort of, exercise science perspective. Yet there do exist a bunch of like I was bringing up the Men's Health magazine on purpose because it does, like, somebody could point to that, but you're saying that, this sort of like what we consider the sort of mainstream conversation around men's health, in particular, their physical well-being and, this kind of exercise science is not actually like very thorough, at least, but not specifically tailored to what men need.
Yeah, so there is a lot of research out there on men's health, don't get me wrong, but what I'm saying is that it's not framed as being men's health research. So the big difference here is that the term women's health is so catchy. So if you go into any biomedical research database and you type in the word phrase women's health, you get all sorts of hits, all sorts of articles. But if you type in the phrase men's health, you don't get as many hits. And the reason is because we haven't kind of conceptualized or abstracted that men's health is a thing, whereas the women's health thing has just taken off, and it's led to so many different organizations that have been founded. It's been led to government agencies that represent women's health. And so that's more what I mean. I don't mean to say that there's no research on men.
No, of course.
There is. It's just not framed as being like male specific or male friendly.
Right. But I mean, there are things that you could say should be open to study. And I know that they are doing this work, so I'm not saying it's not happening. But that is unique to men. Like they're, nobody's talking about things like, endocrine disruptors in the food and in our water, and testosterone and why it's important. Like we treat, I mean, at least I don't know because I'm not in the field like you are, but I know that in like the sort of popular culture, testosterone is seen as like a bad thing if there's too much of it, right? But it's like, and I think that testosterone levels in general have dropped off a cliff in a while. And I think those are important things, as well as, there are certain, like, I don't know if you're looking at the exercise science, maybe there are certain approaches that are, if not specifically tailored to men's needs, that men will get more out of, like certain, routines or practices, right?
Yep. Yeah. And I think it's most problematic in the field of psychology. That's where that is really missing in terms of, do we need to basically change the way that psychotherapy is delivered, because men and women really aren't the same on average. And this whole setup has really been designed to help female patients. So there is a little bit of recognition due to people like, John Barry in the UK that maybe we need to reconsider that type of thing. But the problem right now is that the feminist and sort of the feminist allies have such control over like the funding, like of research, and it's just not male friendly. And as I've pointed out numerous times on my Substack, we have all of these government grants and these offices, and they're all when research is done in a sex specific way, it's for women. Otherwise, no, not for men.
Yes, and we're gonna get into that. You did a lot of digging into UN Women, and they are a particularly vocal, organization. And so, like, can you give us like maybe the short version of, like, first of all, why did you decide to look into this, and what kinds of things did you find?
Okay, so a couple years back, I published a paper which it's in an obscure journal, but it was the only journal I could get it into, which was a demonstration of the bias against men that exists within the UN and the UN's health branch, which is the WHO. So what I did was I went through their websites, I went through their social media profiles, and I just tallied up things like the number of times the word women is mentioned in all of their files versus the number of times the word men is mentioned. And you just see these big differences. So that was a few years back. And they've continued down the same path. Recently, they've become, I think, even much more vocal, attacking the manosphere UN Women has. And so I decided to, because this was at the time when Doge was coming along in the US and investigating
and they found
a lot.
USAID spending, right? Yeah.
Yep. So I decided that I was going to look into UN Women and see, okay, where is all their money coming from? How much do they get? And now, thankfully, they do make all of that information publicly available, as they should, because they are primarily supported by taxpayers of member states.
Governments, yeah.
Yeah. So I just did a full-on investigation into what are their funding sources, how much does each country give, how much do other non-for-profit groups like the Gates Foundation give. And so I just laid out that story because they are very anti-male. They are an explicitly feminist organization, and they have a lot of money.
So let's see what you found with the UN Women thing. I see on your X page. I tried to set up a thing so I can share, but I'm not able to do that right now. So I'm just gonna have to do it word of mouth. But it looks like you're looking at basically taxpayer monies from different governments of different countries and how much went to UN Women. Now, you describe it as confiscated because you're an objectivist. Is that right? Like you're a Randian?
Yes, that'd be correct.
Yeah. So you said for France, for example, between $1 and $10 million, that would be like in U.S. currency, but France money, confiscated from their wallets and sent to UN Women like every year. Since 2011, UN Women has received nearly $50 million from taxpayers in France alone. Okay. And in South Korea, this is actually really interesting. In South Korea, it's between $5 and $12 million. And the reason why I think it all started around the same time, it looks like. Is that right? You got South Korea, you got Japan here, Italy, Germany, Ireland, rather. I'm sorry, I get my flags confused. And what's interesting about South Korea is that there is like it is said by the mainstream that South Korea has got this massive like anti-feminist sentiment among men there. But it's probably because there's an extremely strong feminist movement there too. So it's basically just men pushing back on, the sort of mainstream, right? Is that so? To see that they're spending a lot of money on this, is interesting because it's like they have to fight back. I mean, again, I said 50 million in France. In Japan, it's 25 million, but in South Korea, it's 90 million. So they're really spending a lot of money on that. And I think it's to try to quash that dissent. Like you mentioned, UN Women is putting out, now they're going after the manosphere. I mean, the UN in general is really, but yeah.
Yeah. So with all the graphs that I created, they all start at the year 2011 and then show annual funding. And the reason for that is because that's when UN Women was started, was in 2011. And it started from kind of a series of other kind of women-related organizations that existed within the UN, and then they decided to all come together to now be UN Women. So that's why those graphs that I created start at 2011. You mentioned a couple of the different member states that contribute. The biggest supporters, Sweden is number one. Well, Sweden,
Oh.
and then the European Commission as a whole, actually. But Sweden is up near
You mean
about
like Brussels, like the UN, the European Union? I mean, the European
Yes.
Union. Okay.
Yeah, and then each of then the various European countries then have their own on top of that. So Europeans are
Wow.
dumping a lot into it. Sweden is I think at about $50 million a year, and then I think Norway, Finland, so the Scandinavian countries are really high, and then you have countries like the U.S., Canada, Australia, and the UK, who are at about 15 million per year. So those are the biggest kind of member state contributors. But there's something about this that's even more deceiving. Those are kind of underrepresentations, those numbers. And the reason why is if you look at the rest of my post, you'll see that whereas 80% of the budget comes from individual member states or countries, I think it's something like 15% comes from other UN agencies. So like the UN peacekeeping group and all these other groups. I don't know how it all works, but let's just pretend for a moment they have money left over at the end of the year or something, and then they dump it into UN Women. Now, all that money is coming from taxpayers as well. It's just coming from a different UN organization.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's basically like a new way. Yeah, it's like there's more than just the direct method. There's all these other other ways of getting all of these. It's essentially, what would you say it looks like? We're looking at something like $5 or $6 billion, right?
That's what it is. It's about
I'm looking at your graph. Yeah, proportional contributions. You have a graph here, and the member states make up 80% of that, and it's 4.2 billion. Then you have national committees do like 1%, which is still $52 million. Private and NGOs, which I put in quotes because a lot of NGOs are not, NGO is non-government organizations, but a lot of NGOs are actually just GOs. 4%, 225 million. And then other UN agencies that are essentially parallel to UN Women in some way make up the remaining 15%, which is about $783 million. So that is, Sweden is number one, and they're way up there. And then you have the European Commission, Norway, Finland, UK, Switzerland, Australia, Japan, the US. Down at the bottom, you have China. That's kind of funny. But China's still giving, like they're still giving some. So like, what did you think about when you made these discoveries?
Well, I thought about we need to stop sending this money to UN Women. It's a lot of money. I wanted to make people aware of what their individual, country was doing. And basically, in the article, I come to the conclusion: look, I'm not a big fan of taxpayer money being used for lots of different things, particularly a feminist organization. But if we're going to be sending this money to the UN, can we then at least just split it and create a UN men organization if we're going to do that? But that just goes to show you how bad it all is that we can't even have a UN men organization.
Yeah, like I honestly don't think that they're even trying to help women with this. I think this is just a way to get money redirected in the hands of people who don't want to work for it, honestly, because you mentioned the psychology field or the mental health field and how there is more like talking about women's health and a lot of focus on it. But are women actually better off? I understand that 25% of them are on SSRIs, so they're not even being served by all of the extra attention and money that we're giving them. So men are getting nothing, and women are getting maybe, they're just getting like a kind of a, I don't know, like a Band-Aid on another issue, right? And
Yeah.
it's filling the pockets of these people, and it's taxpayer money too. So
Yeah, and I have not even investigated where this money goes. I'm not sure. That should be publicly available from UN Women, but I haven't looked into it. But I would be really interested to see where all this money goes, because it's not clear, and I can't imagine it's doing much that's very useful or helpful to women.
yeah. Well, no, I don't think it is. I think it's making evil people rich. You've also, so you have like a thing on your page, and again, I suggest you guys check out his Substack, the Nuzzo letter. You also have one here. This is not shocking to me because we've talked about this on the show a lot. But you've also looked into NIH funding of men and women's health research. So that would be the National Institution of Health, right? And
Yep.
it looks like, well, what did you find with that when you looked into that?
So just kind of recalling off the top of my head, you might have it in front of you.
Yeah.
When the NIH gives out, the vast majority of NIH funding does not go towards sex-specific research. I think it's 80% of the budget goes to just research that's not designated as sex-specific. However, when it does go to sex-specific research, it primarily goes to women's health research. And I think it's maybe somewhere like 15% of the budget goes toward women's health, and then about 5% goes toward men's health. And that's been pretty consistent throughout the history from which we have that data, or I have it, which is kind of the late 1980s. And I can tell you that it's very similar in Australia. I have a separate post on the NH and MRC. So that's kind of like...
Yeah, I got that right here. NHMRC. It looks the same. Yeah.
Yeah,
Women
so that's...
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that's Australia's funding body for health research, government body, and the vast majority of that sex-specific funding goes to women's health, as you'll be able to see in that graph.
Yep. Even more than maternal health, women's health. Like in some places, in some examples, it was almost twice or twice as much for women, and men get like a sliver of that, basically.
Yeah. So it's happening everywhere. I do have a separate post on Canada. The Canadian data is a little bit harder to find, and I had to write it up a little bit differently, but it's basically the same story, especially over the past, I don't know, 7 years or so, where they've just gone crazy with all these women's health initiatives and the spending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And we also see you have some data here on suicides among the Australian Defence Force, and it's overwhelmed. That's one place where men are winning. Apparently, they're doing way better on that one than the women are. In that they're suiciding more. So I'm tongue in cheek. So when you found all this stuff, did you try? You said that there was this was lacking, right, when you first got involved. And you apparently had a difficult time getting your paper put in. Did you get any resistance or pushback when you were trying to bring light to these things?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that trying to publish on men's health with a coming at it from a standpoint of kind of sticking up for men politically, that gets you into a lot of trouble in the peer review process. So people are just simply unwilling to empathize with men and the possibility of male disadvantage. And even at my Substack, I write about my experiences trying to publish certain material and the pushback that I get when I try to publish that material. And if I could just summarize it, it's just this inability to understand that men are not as advantaged or as powerful as feminists say, And this just creates this huge roadblock to discussion in academic journals, which is why I now go to Substack to publish this type of stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing that Substack exists. I mean, I think that's like a tremendous thing, right? Because now people can find this kind of stuff that essentially the gatekeepers of I can see knowledge are they're sort of, you can get around them now. You can find this stuff. You wrote another piece here that I thought was very interesting. You sent it to me, actually. It was mankeeping. I never heard this one before. So you wrote a Substack article called "Mankeeping: America's Latest Attack on Men." For the people that are watching, what is mankeeping? Can you help people understand this new made up word?
Yeah, so mankeeping, it's another one of academia's attack on men. And people might be familiar with terms like mansplaining and manels and
What's
what else?
manels?
Manels, think of the word panel as in panel discussion at
Oh,
like a conference. Yeah, it's this kind of critique that, at conferences, the panels are always made up of men and women's voices don't get heard and all that.
Yeah.
So we have a list of these terms that are used to kind of, demonize men in some way. So this one was recently put forward in an academic journal that's published by the APA, so the American Psychological Association, which makes it all the worse. And it's a journal called, what is it called? The Psychology of Men and Masculinities.
Yeah.
It's
Psychology
basically
of Men and Masculinities. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a feminist journal. It has nothing really to do with men. And they put forward this idea of mankeeping, which, if I could summarize, goes like this. They start off the article saying that men are struggling in their social relationships right now, more lonely. And so you might want to stop right there and say, okay, well, if that's true, yeah, let's pay some attention to it and see what's going on with men. Let's survey them. How are they feeling? No, that's not where they go with it. They say that this then creates additional unpaid labor for women, because women have to serve as men's kind of emotional carer and their social facilitator throughout life. And this is more unpaid labor, and it reinforces the patriarchy and gender inequality. And so that's what mankeeping is. And as you'll see, I criticize it from many different angles in that piece.
Sure. Yeah, so it's weird too, because it's essentially it's like housekeeping, but you're housekeeping a man who is emotionally in need of support. And this is funny because I'm pretty sure that the same people who wrote that would also write about how men have to open up more because of toxic masculinity, right? And I'm sure that you mentioned that in your rebuttal or this article that you wrote about it. It's just it's so naked that this is just another way. I wonder sometimes, as someone who's also got definitely like an objectivist bent to my worldview, that these are not just things that are made up so that they can continue to get a paycheck. Like they have to constantly create new reasons to exist. It's like any body that is funded by the state. It can't continue to exist on the basis of providing something that people want, therefore they pay for it. Instead, because it doesn't work that way. Instead, they have to essentially construct reasons to need to exist, which is why, by the way, feminism is always necessary and women are always in the worst possible time in history, because otherwise they wouldn't need them anymore, right? And that's what this seems like. It's always men, when they are not showing their emotions, they're toxically masculine, and when they do, then it's women's labor that's there to support them. And of course, men can't find ways to heal by hanging out with other men, by forming spaces with other men, because those have to include women as well, which you have also talked about in your papers.
That's spot on. That's a great summary. And that whole paper is just full of internal contradictions because, as you mentioned, if men do decide to get together with the boys and have some social and leisure time together, well, feminists have been complaining about that for years, that the men, they're not at home
Decades.
helping with the laundry and the cooking. So
Mhm.
that's an internal contradiction. And then when men do decide to get together, for example, in men's sheds or sporting spaces or something, or the Boy Scouts, well, the women demand access to that space. So they can't, what do you want us to do? Like, we just can't ever seem to get a break, can we?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're not supposed to escape because again, the purpose of this is to the job of this kind of, I guess, like these people in academia and in the media and in our government institutions, their primary objective is to justify their own existence, like endlessly, if that
I
makes
agree.
sense, right?
Totally
So,
agree.
yeah, I mean that I don't know how else to look at it. So, um, so we got some 8:33, so we're on really good time. You wrote an article also about anti-male bias in contemporary academia.
Yep.
Um, and what's your like summation of that piece? I see some graphs here as well. And
Okay, so
I
that
understand that women are killing it in academia right now. So, but go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, so that's actually a good example of the peer review system being kind of rigged against men's issues. That piece stems from an article that I did publish about exercise science degrees. And it was just about the growth of the field, just quantifying how many degrees are earned each year. And I split the data by sex. And women are now much more likely to earn a degree in exercise science than men. So in my published paper, I took a little bit of time in the discussion to point out that difference. And I said, why is it that there's now, like, men have clearly plateaued in their interest in this field? No one seems to be really talking about it or concerned about it. And one of the peer reviewers of my paper was interested to know more about that. And so I used that for a full paragraph to explain things. And they were very open. And that was awesome. I got that published. But then what happened was, a group of authors wrote a letter kind of challenging what I was saying, but basically what they were upset about was that I took that paragraph to talk about men's education. That's essentially what it was, because they were saying, "Oh, well, what about women in STEM and blah blah blah?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? Who? This is just a paragraph about men's education. Why would
It's
you
just
not be
one
concerned?"
paragraph in like a longer piece.
That's right. Yep. And so, in academia, in academic publishing, when someone writes in a letter challenging, you then are given the chance to reply with your own letter. And what happens is the two letters get published side by side so that the readers can look at them. So the editor invited me to write a reply to the letter challenging mine. And the editor rejected my letter reply, which is absolutely unheard of in academic publishing. The reason, now that they'll say that there are various reasons that why it was not published, but I came out and just said, in academia, we've got anti-male bias. We need to stop. And I laid out the argument, and that's what my piece is. So because I couldn't publish that letter in the journal, I turned it into a Substack post. And so if people want to see what my argument was, but I was just coming at them, I'm saying, wait a minute, why are you talking about women in STEM right now? Women are represented very, very well throughout academia. They earn 60% of all the degrees. They're making up more. They make up a huge amount of the admin staff and also the faculty. Why can we not take a paragraph to just talk about men's education? And the editor decided to reject my letter, and he didn't like that it said anti-male bias in academia in it.
Wow. So your letter was rejected because you were pointing out something that, and they didn't like try to counter you or debate you on this topic. They just decided not to publish it.
the editor gave justification for rejecting it,
Yeah.
which they would say something like, "Oh, you kind of went off script here a little bit into a side area and blah blah blah." But honestly, in letter writing, that shouldn't matter so much because it's just a short opinion piece. That's what a letter is.
Yeah.
And I'm being challenged by these other people, so I should, get to, so long as I'm not calling them names and swearing and stuff, you
Yeah.
basically should just publish whatever I write. But they apparently did not want my very kind of blunt opinion published on that topic. So that's why I went to Substack with it.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're pointing out something that's true, is it even your opinion anymore? Like, you're just saying, here's the evidence for why we have anti-male bias. Women are doing really well, and everybody knows this. In fact, when you bring it up, it's celebrated, right? Everyone, oh, that's great. Women are doing so much better in academia. They're getting more degrees than men, and men are falling behind. And for some reason, they don't see this as a problem. They see this as some kind of like, it's, I don't know, like there's something correcting, like there's a correcting thing going on. And so you kind of like have to celebrate it and let it go. But then there's no thought given to what the downstream effects of that might be, because, we are seeing now that, women, they get degrees. I question how useful those degrees are a lot of times, because I think that what you're sort of like touching on as well are problems with academia as a whole. Like, just like, are people getting an education? Are they paying, are they going like so many 6 figures into debt, 5 figures into debt for a degree that they're not actually going to use because maybe they didn't really get anything of value out of it? And is that good? Because a woman, like, she might decide she didn't want to do that anymore, or anybody might, and so you have to question, like, what is the degree worth it? Worth all of the debt, worth all of the time? And even if we are supposedly pushing women into STEM, like, I don't think we're going to get the results. I think we're just sort of artificially boosting them. And what does that say about the quality of academia as a whole, especially if there's no sort of rigorous process to determine what is true, so that you're teaching people something real?
Yeah. There are many issues in academia. It's not specific to one country. As you know, I'm based in Australia. It's pretty woke here. A lot of the DEI stuff. It's bad in the US as well. It's bad in Canada. And essentially what's happening is, particularly in the humanities departments, but it is coming into the medical and health sciences, as I mentioned, is just trying to turn people into activists rather than kind of cramming a bunch of knowledge about objective reality into their head. And they're very explicit about this in their academic papers. I know that many of your viewers won't have access to academic journals, but they are very explicit in the humanities journals about turning students into activists. That's what they see the purpose of universities to be. Now, to the extent that men are recognizing a lot of this stuff and choosing not to go to university, I think that is a good thing, if they're aware of what they are doing. I think one thing that could happen is, if that continues to happen and the quality of the university education continues to decline, men are essentially going to be ahead of the curve, because they'll be the ones taking the risk to say, this doesn't seem right, so I'm just going to take the risk and not go to university and do this. But then what you're going to be left with is a lot of women with a lot of useless degrees, and they are going to complain about that. And they're going to say, look, this is again evidence of discrimination against women. We all went to university and now our degrees aren't worth anything. So they're always going to be the perpetual.
And we're in debt, we're the victims, and they're going to ask
That's
basically the government come in and pay off their debt, which is essentially taking money from men and giving it to women.
Yeah,
so
something like that. We can never win. That's the story.
No, not unless some paradigm shift happens. I did get a super chat. Thank you, Zeranx, for the super chat. He gave us $10 and said, it's interesting that the issue of male education is still intentionally ignored today, 33 years after Christina Hoff Sommers had her book tour talking about boys being underserved in education. Yeah, and Warren Farrell has talked about this a lot as well. And yeah, it hasn't really changed a lot, and in fact, I think it's only gotten worse. And yet, everyone is like, they're all shaking their fist at like I guess biological men playing in women's sports is like the thing we have to worry about, not like men falling behind. And what another thing that's going to happen as a result of this is like the biological reality is that women with degrees, even if they're useless degrees, they'll be looking for men who have more earning potential than what their degree suggests they should have, even if they don't have it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they're going to be
Yeah.
looking for men that just don't exist. So,
Yeah.
and that's what's happening now,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, this is where it gets really annoying when you start reading articles in the Guardian and the New York Times and all these women complaining, "Oh, where did all the good men go?" and all that. And so you're seeing a stream of those articles start to come out now. So it's just they just don't understand all the connection points. They really don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's going to be a major issue. There was another article that I saw that I thought was interesting. It's kind of older. It was about Title IX, and you were saying that Title IX is sort of it was not the start of history, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit? I thought that was a really interesting one too, because a lot of people talk about Title IX like it exists in a vacuum. So what were you going to say? What do you say about that?
Yeah, so that article relates to a topic that I've spent a lot of time on, which is about the representation of women as research participants in studies. And because this is a big part of the feminist narrative, it's one of the things they go with, and that is the continued claim that women are underrepresented as research participants, that women's health is underfunded. And I've written extensively about this, and it's not true. And I show all the data. Now, in my field, and so it's becoming, this has existed within medical and health sciences since like the early 1990s, this narrative. But it's come into exercise science within the past few years, and it's really accelerating and taking off. That, there's not enough information about women in sports because we don't ever do sports science research on women. Now, there is more credibility to that claim in sports science than in health and medical science, more generally speaking. But what a lot of contemporary female academics don't do is look at the historical archives of journals. My piece on history didn't start at Title IX. What I mean by that is, if you look back through old physical education journals or physical therapy journals, those are fields that predated exercise science. And if you take time to look through the archives of those journals, you'll find all sorts of women participating in research studies, having their maximal strength tested, their vertical jump ability, their ability to learn the tennis serve in physical education class. And so the whole point of that article was to say, because right now we have a huge problem. It relates to this kind of the poor education that university students are getting. They are not encouraged to look at history and study history. So basically, they look at journal articles published maybe as late as 2005, and then they have no idea what happened before, like they were born, for example. And if you look into those archives, you'll see all sorts of photographs of women participating in research. It may not have been 50% representation, but why should we expect that anyways? So the point of that article was just to say, we kind of these people seem to think that history started at Title IX for women, but no. Female physical educators and female physical therapists were very interested in women's health prior to Title IX.
Yeah, and speaking of which, you were talking about how much of a hoo-ha, a hullabaloo they make about women's representation in sports. And a lot of the arguments that come out will be something like, well, if women don't see other women doing well, like why we spend, so much money trying to make the WNBA happen, for example, so that women will have the same kind of clout that, say, the NBA has. Is that otherwise, if women don't see it, it doesn't happen. But do women even watch this stuff? Because I know you did a piece on that as well. So do women watch women's sports? What did you find with that?
Yeah, well, just to start, it's actually kind of challenging to find that data, which is very strange considering how many people and groups do surveys and how many academics do surveys on different topics. And I think the reason that data is so hard to find is because they don't want to see what the answer is,
Right.
which is that women are generally not so interested in watching women's sports. And what the data that I put together that I found show is that men are more likely to watch women's sports than women are.
Yes.
So I think that's why we don't have that data, is they don't want to see it. They don't want to see that result.
Yep. And you did find it, but it was hard to do. Yep. And obviously not popular because essentially the results are not convenient because it goes against the narrative. So it looks like, in every country that you have data for, France, Spain, Germany, Canada, Australia, UK, USA, more men watch women's sports than women do. And that's funny. Is there any way of knowing why men would watch that? Is it like a curiosity or go ahead?
Oh, no, I think men have an inclination toward rules-based games and situations and strategies and stuff like that. And that is what's so unfortunate about all the feminist narratives, is just this inability to understand men and women at a fundamental level and talk about these things that make us unique and interesting. And there's men that will watch all sorts of stuff that involves strategy and gaming and
or
things like that.
Athleticism or something, they want to see what the human body can do. I remember as a child, I used to like watching this TV show called American Gladiators, and you had these these people that were very fit and they were engaging in these competitions. It was men and women. So I didn't really think about how many men are there or how many women are there. It was more abstracted, I guess.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think one of the really unfortunate things with sports is that they're trying to push so hard that they come out with overt kind of messaging about feminist related messaging. Mm-hmm. Whereas I never used to think about that when I would watch sports. I would go and I'd watch my high school's girls volleyball team, and I would love watching that. And it was
volleyball, great. Women's volleyball is always fun to watch.
Yeah, and but now my mindset is completely different because especially on television, you get all these personal stories worked in about this and that, and it's I'm not here. This is my escape from the political realm. I just want to see people do sports and watch their kind of technical expertise. But now it's become so politicized that I think a lot of guys are tapping out from watching sports.
Yeah. The whole thing is not like when I was a kid and I watched my Bulls play when I lived in Chicago when Michael Jordan was on the team, and it was just, it was so much fun. But I think we've certainly lost that, because one of the other things that I think men really enjoy about sports too is watching the cooperation between men, the teamwork. Is that leads to your comment about strategy. When you see a team that is in the zone together and they're executing something, whatever sport it is, that is extremely fun to watch. That's what I think that people miss about what sports is. A lot of times they think of it as competitive. That's part of the feminist narrative around it, is that men are competitive and they want to dominate each other, but they don't notice that there's a cooperative element too. And sportsmanship, which is kind of I think that's also something that's lost in modern sports. Sportsmanship, or good sportsmanship, is something where the loser is glad they played and they learned something from it, and there's they sort of like boxers, they grow closer together after the fight.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think, and just to tell your readers, a lot of the problems that come into the sports realm, like the politicalization of it and all that, it stems from academia. You can
Yeah.
trace it back to academic journals. The things that are written in sports philosophy journals, for example, or sports sociology, they're just complete rubbish. But that's where a lot of that politicalization happens. So the way that and feminists are very much involved in that. So they see sports as a tool for social change, but in a very explicit way, meaning that that's sort of like its main purpose. Now, sports might lead to social change, but it happens more naturally. It's not the kind of explicit goal. So when you see these different things pop up in the sports realm that kind of rub you the wrong way, like they're too political, you can blame academia.
Yeah, for sure. The idea is to get to essentially make it to where you can't really escape it. So that's why they put it everywhere, because they're trying to force the dialectic, right? Like everywhere you look, there's the dialectic, and you have to, because they're trying to push it, push it, push it. So, okay. So we're getting close to the end, but I do want to ask you. So we did talk a little bit about your interest in talking about, well, I guess you could say cultural things. You have an article here called, and I didn't read it, so I don't really know, but you have an article here called Men, Masculinity, and Movies, One Thing Kevin Sorbo Got Wrong. And so is that like your first sort of like dipping the toes into this romantic, cultural thing?
I've published one other piece, my Substack. It is called Free Will and the Romantic Revolution at the Cinema, I think is the name of that piece. And so I'm a big movie fan, but I'm not the sort of person that just watches random movies and just likes random bits of action or anything like that. Movies are a form of art, and they serve a very important purpose in our lives, and they represent the underlying philosophy of the screenwriter, basically. And I think we don't have a good understanding, like the common viewer doesn't really realize that. And I think if some basic principles can be taught about what it is you're kind of watching and why some movies cause you to have a like kind of a more sort of profound emotional reaction that make you feel kind of not necessarily good afterwards, but like they make you feel something, as opposed to movies that you kind of walk out of the theater and you're like, ugh, what was that? So my goal is to try to explain that to people, and so that it's interesting, that piece on Kevin Sorbo. So Sorbo wrote a really good piece for Fox News, and I really liked it. I think it was mostly spot on, except for one thing, and that's where I am critical of him. And that piece at my Substack has gotten a lot of attention with men debating each other and debating me. It's probably been the one that has rubbed men the wrong way the most out of anything I've written. And it's because it sort of comes down to like defining characteristics of masculinity and stuff. And I can see that there was more comments on it this morning when I woke up. So I'm going to let that one kind of continue to settle, let people talk about it and think about it. But basically, my reason for writing it is it just stems from my personal interest in movies and recognizing their importance.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, I'm a big movie fan. I love movies, and I get what you're saying. I think that films can give, or any kind of media that tells a story can give, I guess, one of three impressions. One of them is the kind of like, indifference, like there was not a lot of substance there. Maybe it was a fun popcorn movie, but you didn't really walk away with like a lot from it. It's not disgusting, but there's just nothing there, like a Michael Bay Transformers flick or something like that. Not my thing. Then you get like the movies that leave an impression, and they're not necessarily, like you said, they won't necessarily like be uplifting, but sometimes they will. But they'll definitely leave you thinking. And if they're really good, they're profound in that. And a lot of that, and then you have the ones that give you that revulsion, sometimes because they're really bad, but sometimes because when you realize what the person who made the film is trying to say, it tells you something really dark about them. And that's what, like, that's the one that really you know what I'm saying? Do you have a,
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
you can you think of an example of a movie that's done that to you?
That's kind of made me feel the creeps.
Yes, like about the
Mhm.
director and the writers, like that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, anything that is basically that shows the worst in man, I would say will do that. I haven't watched American Psycho in a while. I watched it once. I
Uh-huh.
think Michael or Christian Bale or
Christian
whoever it is,
Bale. Yeah,
but
Christian
it's just
Bale.
about basically about like he's just a serial killer and he just goes around killing girls that he invites over to his apartment or something like that. So now I know some people will come up with different arguments about why that sort of thing is important, but mostly you can show evil things, but within the context of a different film. So in those sorts of films that give me the creeps, the sort of the bad guy is kind of put out there as the main focal point and almost kind of like a hero, kind of you admire it. And that is not the romantic school of art at all. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big advocate of, yeah, like you said, romantic realism. It doesn't they're not cheesy movies. That's not what that is. It doesn't mean, and it doesn't even mean romantic love necessarily, although
Right.
romantic love does feature in a lot of movies because it's a huge part of human nature. So it should feature. But yeah, these types of nihilistic movies, I think I haven't seen much of Stanley Kubrick's stuff recently, but Kubrick sort of came across as a bit of a nihilist with some of the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that he would make. Those would be just some off the top of my head, but I struggle
Yeah.
because after I watch them once, I don't go back to them because
Yeah.
there's no reason for me to watch them. They don't do anything to my
Yeah.
soul. They don't uplift me in any way.
You know, you want to hear something really crazy? Literally, I watched American Psycho last night with my wife.
Oh,
like,
okay.
but like, I'm gonna be doing a discussion about the movie with someone else on a video, and he proposed the film. He was like, "How about American Psycho?" And I said, "Yeah, I own it on DVD because I don't think it's well. I don't want to get too much into it, but I don't actually think it's as nihilistic. What it does tell you something though about the writer of the original book as well as the director of the film. It's one of those movies where the people who made it wanted to say something. They were obviously trying to critique masculinity, toxic masculinity. It's not just that, late stage capitalism, like all of these, sort of like bog standard leftist talking points. They just crammed them all to one movie. And the guy who wrote it was a self-admitted sexually confused weirdo that wanted to, and he was trying to suggest that he's not the weird one, everyone else is, and that's kind of what the book is about. And you end up not necessarily like sympathizing, because that's the thing you don't want, is to like make an obviously evil nihilistic character and then make people like them, but they don't really make him unlikable. They make everyone else unlikable, and he seems like the
Mhm.
normal one. And I don't think that was on purpose. Sometimes films get made and the director has an intention or the writer has an intention, but it doesn't hit the same way they thought. Kind of like Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, which was trying to say, was based on Heinlein's book of the same name, and he was like a libertarian, kind of a radical libertarian for the time, and he was telling a story about a libertarian society, and Verhoeven saw that and thought, oh, he didn't even read the book. He just like read the back of it or something and said, this guy's fascist, and tried to tell like a fascist story, but didn't change the story that much. So when people left it, they were like, oh, those are the good guys. They just dress in like, Hugo Boss uniforms, but they're actually not villains, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just funny because I just watched American Psycho. That's really interesting. For me, there is one movie that I always bring up because it left me feeling like really like off, and it's called Midsummer, and it's a horror film. I believe I can't remember the name of the director. It might be Alex Garland, but I might be wrong about that. And it is about like this holiday in Sweden called Midsummer, which is like the longest day of the year, but it's essentially this cult, and it's very, very misandrous. Like when, some degree of misandries in films, I expect it because that is sort of like the water we swim in. But this one was really bad. Like the way that, and what was worse than that is that all of the people who reviewed it not only didn't see that, but they actually agreed with the misandry, like, without knowing they did. They were like, oh, this was everything that happened to the men in this movie was deserved, right? And so yeah, I think that's the one that puts me off. So if you want to like do an analysis of something really misandrous, watch Midsummer. That guy always makes nihilistic movies. He made that movie Hereditary. That one, like, obviously it ends in a really like black note as well. So
yeah, I've not seen either one of those, and they don't sound like anything I want to spend an hour and a half watching, to be honest. Sometimes, yeah, you do need to expose yourself to it to just kind of to be able to see the differences between the different schools of art. But yeah, like you said, it's kind of a way to enter into the mind or the philosophy of the person that wrote the story. And we do have the capacity to choose what we do and don't write about. And I think we're due for sort of what I call the romantic revolution, or maybe you think of it as kind of a counter revolution, actually, where we we establish some of these less kind of nihilistic and kind of less, like Kevin Sorbo was pointing out in that piece, not every movie has to show some clown of a guy, who's got low self-esteem and he can't make something out of himself, and all he
like
does,
a man-child character.
Yeah. And so that's the sort of thing that Kevin Sorbo was going on about that I also agree with. So, hopefully we see some changes out of Hollywood, because I don't know, they're not really putting out much that's worth watching.
No, they've had like a writer's strike, and I think they're in real serious trouble. And James Gunn's, from what I understand, James Gunn made a new Superman film, and Superman is another man-child, whiny, like Zoomer kid. So they're not going to learn. But you know what, James, that was a really good conversation. Tell everybody where they can find you. Maybe we'll have you back on and just talk about like movies. I think that could be fun, or cultural things.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And hopefully I can publish a few more things about it as well. It's just a little bit tricky. All this other stuff related to funding differences and men's health is important. So
yes,
that takes up a lot of my time. But you can find me at my Substack, which is called the Nuzo Letter. And then also I'm quite active on X, and my handle is at James L. Nuzo.
All right. Thank you so much, James. Sorry for mispronouncing your last name. I didn't know it was Nuzo.
No, man.
I should have asked you before, so my bad on that. All right. Well, I don't have any more messages from anybody, but I do see the chat is lively. So thank you guys so much for joining us on the show, and thank you so much for coming on, James. I really appreciate it. We'll have to have you back on to talk about movies and stuff. So with that said, guys, if you like this video, please hit like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications, leave us a comment, let us know what you guys think about what we discussed in the show today. And please, please, please share this video, because sharing is caring. Thank you guys so much for coming on today's episode of the Fireside Chat, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.
Men's right activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.